Hello, everyone, and welcome to my media reaction of Severance, Season 2, Episode 1, the opener for the much anticipated season. Hello, Miss Cobel. So, after each episode, I'm just going to do an immediate review and overview of what happened, what my thoughts are, and then more towards the middle of the week, I'll have more fleshed out thoughts about what I think is happening. But let's just get into it, all right? So the episode starts, we got the sneak peek, but Mark is running around in the hallways. He's looking for the wellness center. He finds it, but it is empty. Then he comes across his new team member. So I previously mentioned that there was a Spanish speaker. He's not speaking Spanish, he's speaking Italian. So the Italian speaker, his name is presumably Dario. The woman is Gwendolyn, and then we meet Mark W. But before he gets more information about these new three team members, Milchek comes in, and he herds him to his new office where he also meets Miss Huang, who is a child. My theory again about Miss Huang is that there might be something happening where, because the innies are technically children, maybe the next step in the biotechnology is having children actually represented as their innie self. So maybe Miss Huang, because she's a managing or deputy manager, is that she's been at Lumen for a while, but they've been able to update the technology to reflect her age. So she looks like she's around 8 years old, maybe 8 to 12. So maybe she's worked at Lumen for 8 to 12 years. And when she says when I was born, she's more so talking about when she was severed. But who knows? That's just a theory I have right now. Milchek tells Mark that he, of course, is the new Miss Cobel, and that's been 5 months since the original MDR team had their overtime contingency situation, or what we'll find out is called now the Macrodat Uprising. But essentially, Miss Cobel becomes a scapegoat. It's said that she was fired because of the uprising, but we know that actually she was fired because the board found out that Helly, or who we now know as Helena Egan, Helly tried to kill Helena Egan because she tried to hang herself in the elevator. So that's what was happening. And then, of course, also this presumption that she was trying to have a throuple with her, Mark Innie, and Mark Audi. And that's why Mark Innie was able to see Miss Cobel in the Audi environment. All right, so that's what happened. And, of course, Mark asks about his team, says he does not trust Milchek's assertion that they have not come back. They decide to not come back. Great instinct to not trust Milchek, but of course he's sent back to his new team. We learned a little bit more about the team. We learned that Mark W and Gwendolyn worked in Branch 5X. Apparently this was a far more advanced office. Like they had animatronics, but also I guess, and I don't know if other people sense this, that there was a tension between Gwendolyn and Mark W. Of course, we later see that Mark W says that his team was full of dirtbags. I'm not sure why Gwendolyn wouldn't also be a dirtbag, but we'll have to wait and see. And then we see that Miss Huang comes in and plays the ball game. We also saw this from season 1, but they were not around the table. They were just in a circle in chairs, but here they're at a table. We see that also, by the way, Dario apparently didn't have an elevator. He had a rope. I don't know what's going on there, but I do see that they had 200, they're in 206 countries. But my big question about this new team members is like, where did they come from? Did somebody on the outside actually move closer, or were they just on a different floor in Lumen? Maybe what happens is that Lumen is testing in Kier PE, which is where they are located, different ways that the innies can operate. Who knows? I don't know. Regardless, Mark S is not having it. He's not having it. Miss Huang tries to assert her managerial role and say she's not a friend of Mark S. And immediately the next day, Mark S is like, bitch, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to frame Mark W for trying to get out and trying to get something to get past the code detectors. But of course, Milchek finds it and he reads the whole note aloud. There's this very hilarious moment where we see that, first of all, Mark W initially called Milchek Milkshake, and then beyond that, he calls Milchek a shambolic rube. And this is, of course, Mark S speaking as if he's Mark W. The entire team sees that. Mark S is relieved of his duties as department head and is given to Mark W. But Mark S is able to tell the team, hey, you didn't see what I did to the kitchenette. And he immediately bolts to Milchek's office where he's able to connect to that speaker, which is supposed to connect to the board. And he tells him that he's not having it and he wants to be back with his team. Instead of being sent to the break room, which would have definitely happened in season 1, we see that Mark S is just sent back to the elevator. Now, we don't know the time that happens between this, but I personally wouldn't be surprised if this all happened in one day. Like, this is all just happening in one day. They decided to go one route. There's option A, and then they choose option B. So in option B, Mark S comes immediately down, and he sees a painting that we will find is called Keir Pardons the Betrayers. This is really important because it is clear that while there seems to be messaging that the Macrodat uprising was a great thing for any morale and it helped create reform, they're still confronted with this picture of Keir pardons his betrayers. And you see Keir with this sword with a bunch of blood on it. I'm going to examine it further in my midweek review. But yeah, it definitely seems extremely violent. And of course, it's depicting the 4 members of the original MDRT, Mark, Irving, Dylan, and Helly, sort of being pardoned by Keir. Okay, Miss Huang escorts them to the new break room, which we see is not as hostile as the original break room from season 1. There are lights, I guess. Mr. Milchick greets them and shows them a video, and the video apparently is going to be shown to all innies from now on. I really doubt that that's actually going to happen, but the video is so awesome. It's like claymation, and it's very funny, and it basically shows the outside of the Lumen building and gives them kind of perspective of what the Lumen building looks like, which I think is quite brave, I guess, but really at the end of it, it's not really saying anything, is it? Apparently the building has been there since 1870. We learned that Lumen's operating in 206 countries. We learn about the quote-unquote Macrodat uprising video. And what's so funny is that they used the recording of Mark and Irving. So it's clear again that they were in season 1, that they were being recorded at all times. And it does bring up this question of why didn't Lumen stop them? You know, clearly they had all the intel that they needed, that things were going awry, but why didn't they say anything? Which brings up a theory that I kind of tentatively have, is that they intentionally wanted this uprising to happen, but not at this pace. They were surprised at how quickly it happened. And of course, all of this is Mr. Milchick's fault because he exposed the overtime contingency and didn't tell the rest of the team. So maybe that they could build better gates so that they would never use the overtime contingency. But again, the video ends. We get an idea in the video that there are new incentives, including new snacks, and there's this really offensive video of like Dylan just seeming like to love all these new perks. It's really weird. And then there's also the hall pass, which shows like Helly dragging Mark, so it's kind of like inferring like, you know, a visit, a sexual type. But then also there's pineapple bobbing, which also felt very sexual. In my opinion, it looked a little bondagey. And also to me, it reminded me of those paintings that you see of people right before they get guillotined during the French Revolution, right? Like she's on her knees with rope behind her. And of course we find that she's bobbing for pineapples. But to me, it felt like, I don't know, girl. It seems like you might be getting guillotined. And apparently a mirror room. And I'm excited to see if the mirror room will be used in the season. Okay, so then after the video ends, Milchick says, quote unquote, the innies have a choice to stay. We know that that choice is a false illusion because we know that the innies die if they don't stay. So that he's basically saying either die or work, which is kind of, you know, it's a little Holocausty, but you either die or you work. So even though it's an illusion of choice, right? When Helly was making all those protests in season 1, I don't think she fully grasped this idea of that she wouldn't exist. But we'll have to wait and see. Anyway, Milchick tells them that there's no recording in any of these rooms. Don't believe it. That sounds like bullshit to me. I don't know why the team then just immediately started to whisper about what their adventures were on the outside. But of course, Mark tells his story, importantly saying that Miss Casey is apparently the deceased wife of his Audi. And then we see Helly lie. I knew that this would happen, but I briefly just went on Twitter simply to find some high definition screenshots, since I assume other people already did that. And we see that there's this theory going around that this is actually Helena Egan. Now, I kind of believe that's true, but there's a part of me that also believes that this is just Helly. I think the idea that Helly would be deceptive isn't too far-fetched for me. Like, she was very sneaky in season 1. She got that paper cutter and threatened to cut her fingers. She hung herself. Like, she's willing to do this extreme stuff. And I think the reason why she doesn't say anything, if it is Helly that is here, the reason she doesn't say anything to her fellow team members is because the truth would be then, well, why did your outie then decide to come back down? What is their outie's ulterior motive? And it would kind of change the whole dynamic of her team with Helly. Like, that's just the case. I could see this truly just being any Helly, and any Helly sort of having an issue with the reality of who she is and realizing that her team members would perceive her differently if they knew what actually happened. But what's also interesting is that Irving immediately clocks the weird story that she tells. She said she just woke up in the apartment in a t-shirt and she goes outside and sees a gardener. And Irving, and I also find it interesting that the Innie would know this. Irving is like, a gardener at night. Now, I'm going to say there is a big caveat here, right? Because for those, I used to live in California for like 3 years. And in California, gardeners did work at night because, of course, that would mean that things are cooler and the water would be easier to spread. So I also grew up in South Florida. And so a lot of gardening work sometimes happened at night because it was just extremely cooler at night and easier to do that stuff. But anyway, he clocks that in most places in America, it'd be weird to have a night gardener. So yeah, it's interesting that Irv is the one to clock this, and I wonder if he'll also be the one to figure out that she's Helena Egan. And then we find that Irv refuses to tell them what happened. Irv runs away, and we see the team split between Helly and Mark and Dylan and Irv. So Helly and Mark clearly have this little flirtatious thing going on where Helly is trying to, suss out whatever romantic relations that maybe Mark had with Miss Casey, but he's clear that they're not the same. And this is another reason why I think that the Helly is actually any Helly, is because she says she's nothing like her outie, and she makes it seem very sincere, and it wouldn't seem like something that the outie Helena would be able to state. But again, we don't know. I don't know. But again, I'm sure outie Helena also has the ability to watch all the tapes of any Helly, so maybe she's just replicating how any Helly acts. I don't know, but that felt sincere to me. And either way, we find that both Mark and Helly decide to stay in order to find Miss Casey. And Helly's like, yeah, I'll help you find Miss Casey for your outie. And who knows where that will end up. But Dylan and Irv, now this scene was one of the most beautiful scenes ever. I need to see more Dylan and Irv together. I need to see them solo. They are a great pair to put together. Just really beautiful. Basically, Dylan is preventing Irv from leaving. Again, this understanding that if Irv leaves, his innie dies. And he says that Irv is the part that makes him good. And Dylan clearly gets a lot of satisfaction in being a macrodata refiner, and he believes that Irv's a huge part of that. And then Irv says something so beautiful. He says, I'm your favorite perk. Anyway, the scene was really beautiful. Irv does tell Dylan about Bert, this idea that Bert has another partner. But he also says that his outie, Irv's outie, is painting this corridor in the elevator that goes further down, which of course ties together to Helly and Mark's conversation, because if they find that elevator, there's arguably the opportunity to find where Miss Casey is, because that's the last we saw of Miss Casey going down that elevator. All right, so Dylan and Irv's beautiful scene is interrupted by Miss Huang, who says that Milchek is looking for them. We see that Milchek is still getting the welcome screen of Hello, Miss Cobel, which is where we get the name of this episode. I also want to note that, Milchek betrayed Miss Cobel, right? He didn't tell her that he used the overtime contingency for Dylan, which is a huge reason why they're in this situation in the first place. So he really hurt Miss Cobel, but at the same time, she was ultimately fired because Helly hung herself. So that has nothing to do with Mr. Milchek's actions. But I wonder if he kind of lied to the board about exactly what was happening on the severed floor, because a lot of the things that happened were his fault. And you would assume that if the board was fully aware of what Milchek was doing, that they wouldn't allow him to take over Miss Cobel's place. So what we find is that Mr. Milchek is trying to tell Dylan about this new kind of layout that they're going to have, which is the Audi family visitation suite. He also tells Dylan that his wife's name on the outside is Gretchen. But yeah, the Audi visitation room very much gives prison feel. When prisoners get to visit their family, it's also in this very sterile environment. So I assume that that's what's happening. And as well, I believe that Milchek is trying to socially engineer a split with the team, right? So now Dylan has this other incentive. He wants to be able to meet his family. And so that's only going to happen, I assume, if he keeps up with Mr. Milchek's shenanigans and maybe even becomes like a spy for Mr. Milchek. We'll have to wait and see. But we know that Dylan is highly motivated to know more information about his Audi family. And he understands that Mr. Milchek is the key to that. We also see when Dylan leaves that Miss Huang is playing a game. It's very different from the Audi game. It seems like she's getting rings into these different files, but then we also see that she has like an actual physical version of a game, which I remember playing as a kid as well. We'd go to the fairs, or if there was some event at school, maybe they'd give out this toy where you could use these rings and try to blow them with air bubbles into like a water thing. But beyond that, I also sense that there was immense tension between Miss Huang and Mr. Milchek. And again, Mr. Milchek is unsevered, so he should be more freaked out that there's a literal child working with him, but he doesn't seem to be concerned about that. But yeah, I'm a little bit interested to see the dynamic between Miss Huang and Mr. Milchek. And quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if Miss Huang is actually the one running everything, because maybe the board does know about Mr. Milchek's shenanigans and they just need him to be a familiar face, an authoritative figure, but ultimately he's being run by Miss Huang, and Miss Huang is really the one running everything. And again, maybe Miss Huang is really an adult brain in a child's body because of how innies are essentially, again, the child version of their adult self. But we'll have to wait and see. Anyway, we see that the entire team has decided to stay and they go back to refining. But before they get to the end of refining, we see that while Mark is refining, there is a jump scare of Miss Casey looking at him and seeming to do similar work on the back end. So we'll have to wait and see what's going on there. Again, I think everything has to do with the four tempers and this idea that Kier had that control of the four tempers means control of the world. And so maybe what's happening is that the refiners are just being observed by other people who are trying to assess what is going on with their tempers and how they decide these numbers fit into the bin. Who knows? I'll get more into it. I'm excited to learn more editing. I think I finally figured out how to actually get clips from the episodes into videos. So we'll just have to wait and see. But thank you so much if you have watched this video. I appreciate it so much. And this was Strategic Delusion.